Okay, we're going to start now. So welcome everyone to this webinar. We have a pretty cool group of mostly product leaders in the house. And, why are we doing this? Maybe I should set some context first. Product is on everybody's mind these days. Product is evolving. I've been in this space for, almost 50 to 20 years and spent a lot of time at Google, but also now run Peak Product, which is a company who focus on product. We run the Product Management Festival. There's a lot of movement, right? And one specific theme we wanted to talk about with you is this potential transition from product leadership to general management. Why are we doing this? Well, because it's something we see more and more happening. We see, CEOs becoming or product folks becoming CEOs, but we also see CEOs looking somewhat differently at product leaders these days. We see boards looking at product leaders. So it's a thing, it's happening. And we thought it could be a great discussion to have with actually, a bunch of folks that know about that. And this is essentially a group from Egon Zehnder, which is really deeply plugged into the market. But also then to some extent me and others talking about that aspect and being able to talk about that journey. So I'm gonna kick this off. This is sort of the title from CPO to CEO. These are the experts I mentioned. So we have Anna and Mark from Egon Zehnder, who are really deeply plugged into this market, have this conversation every day. And by the way, beyond the product leaders themselves, right? They have the context talking, they're plugged into boards, they're plugged into executives. And then we have Tobias. He is actually someone I've worked with now for a while. I would consider him like a prototypical product CEO. So he doesn't have the classical product, journey, but he's a CEO that I got to know as someone who is really deeply caring about product, and actually probably has built his career on understanding product, right? And business as well, of course, but really deep understanding product. So he's gonna be sort of the expert in this forum. By the way, we're gonna record this, so I hope that's okay for you. We have many folks signing up that maybe will wanna go back to the recording or watch it later. The goal is that we have only about 30 minutes of content. So we have a kind of quick summary of slides, but then also we want to open it up to conversations. So really get your questions in. We want to do this very interactive. At about minute 25 to 30, we're going to open up the floor. Mark is going to moderate. Please put your questions in the chat later on, and then we can address them. But really, we want to have a lively conversation because you're quite a knowledgeable audience. So we're going to set the stage. Talking about setting the stage, I know most of you are product experts, so I don't think you need any introduction to product management. But I thought I'd still talk a little bit about, how I see maybe the current state of things. And this is very basic for most of you, but really product management sits at the intersection at different functions these days, right? Classically in the Bay Area, it's often, there's a product technology context. People have studied computer science, but there's also increasingly a customer perspective, like this could be the sales dimension. This is, of course, things like UX and others, but also the convergence to some extent with business, right? That's partially also what we're addressing here, like the product management essentially moving from a functional discipline into business. And again, all of this, it's way beyond the point where somebody puts this into, the tech or the IT department. This has become center stage and really, bringing value in the company together and creating value for the company, actually. I always like to talk a little bit about, what priorities people set or what lens people have. And I like to distinguish two dimensions or two spheres. And the left one is building the right product. And then the right one is building the product right. And they sound similar, but they're actually very different. And what I mean with building the right product is really the innovation part of it, right? And like actually finding out what you want to build. Some people call this discovery, but there are many words for that. You could call it product innovation, but it's really the one I think that makes or breaks a product strategy, and in the end has a big impact on company strategy. It's like, do you have product market fit? Do you scale with your product? And as you all know, right, there's a lot of innovation stuff. There's users, research, data, looking at opportunities. So there's a lot of that stuff there. By the way, anecdote, I've been at Google for a long time before I left. And this is something the Bay Area and the US gets very much right. And then on the right sphere, on the right dimension, this actually is something that I think Europe tends to focus on. Maybe a little bit too much even. I think Europe loves process. Europe loves, tools and methods. And so I'm not saying this is less important. I think it's equally important. But I think it's important to do both, right? And I think traditionally making a mistake if you're too much focusing on process and methods and all of that. But all of this, you're an esteemed group of product leaders, but I just thought it might be helpful also for the discussion later to distinguish the two. And then a few best practices. Again, many of you know that you actually talent yourself. You're some of the product leaders that we all, respect and want to, stay in touch with. Talent is key, right? This is what I've shown so far is nothing you can obviously learn in a few years. You need a lot of business context, need a lot of experience, and I think, and again, back to the discussion maybe later, Europe and the US slightly have also, to some extent, a different approach. Kind of, is this a key function or not? But in my perspective, talent is key. The innovation part, to my previous point, is a tough one. It's not trivial to get that right. And Tobias maybe will have thoughts about this as well, like in the interaction of letting go and empowering versus keeping control. There's tension. That's not easy. I'm a big believer in empowering, but then staying accountable and managing the stakeholders, managing process. The ceiling for me is critical, again, and Tobias will probably have many thoughts about this, and not just put it under an execution function. I'm not a big fan of putting PMs under CTO, and this might be also a point for discussion later. Whether it's peers, whether you need two C functions is a different discussion. I'm sure the Egon Zehnder folks will have lots of thoughts about this. But whatever you do, it needs to be supported by the top management, because it's really a corporate thing, right? It's a company thing. It's not a thing you can delegate. It takes courage. There's an element of risk taking and embracing to some extent something that is not always fully predictable, and you need to have some learning and feedback loops there. And with that comes also a cultural dimension. And again, if you allow me that, there's also something I think European companies slightly struggle more to go through that, somewhat risk seeking or risk tolerant aspect. So this is my quick intro, and I'm now very happy to hand over to Anna, who is in Egon Zehnder, one of the global product leads in the recruiting and in the industry. Anna, please take it from here.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. We're so happy to be a part of this session, and definitely wanted to be interactive. We don't want to talk at you the whole time, and I might call on Tobias a lot during this portion, because I think there's an interesting interplay since we're talking about product officers becoming CEOs. Well, so this is what sparked this webinar, is all the news. I think certainly in the States, it feels like once every other week we're hearing about a new appointment of a product leader becoming a CEO. I think the most recent ones on the slide are Simon at Marqeta. Also, we were all talking internally about Neil Mohan at YouTube. But it's not also just technology. It is dominantly software and tech, but we see the MasterCard appointment as well. So we're seeing a lot of this. And so this created a lot of curiosity, frankly, across our entire team. And for me personally, I see product leaders as general managers to really dive deeper. So Raphael, maybe we'll go to, or whoever's driving, we'll go to the next slide. So we conducted a survey that many of you were a part of, and just to lay the groundwork, it's quite a few responses. So 173 responses, pretty evenly split between CPO and kind of the layer below. Pretty globally distributed, definitely skews a little bit more to the US in terms of our sample size, and a lot of digital companies represented. But this just gives you a little bit of a grounding, because we'll share some data and insights so you know where these came from. Next, so what did we see and what did we learn? And I think, Tobias, please chime in here because you and I were talking a bit about this in our prep. So what's interesting is about 2/3 of folks surveyed report directly to the CEO. By the way, considering only half are CPO, that's quite interesting. So it means a heavy focus in terms of executive attention. The key peer is CTO. I think a lot reported the overwhelming majority, almost all, have some influence or at least reporting structure with engineering, high influence on marketing, as well as sales. I think to be curious, you and I had an interesting conversation here on sort of the formulation of the role, kind of both leaning more technical, both leaning more commercial. Anything you would add here in terms of your reflections?
Yeah, thank you. So obviously I've been looking at this data and super interesting to kind of get these insights. I asked myself a couple of questions and I'd like to kind of get your feedback in the Q&A about this. If only 2/3 report to the CEO, I'm wondering where the other third is reporting to. That means obviously that's probably organizations that fold the product function either under the CTO or the CMO. That's just an assumption here. It's in my experience. I mean, it's also reflected in the numbers here. There's clearly strong ties between the engineering function and the product function. My personal opinion, and that's very much dependent on the industry, on the company, on the product itself. I'm obviously definitely in the camp of tying engineering and product together very, very closely. And I'd even go as far as saying, if that's the case, product should eventually be in the lead. And I have examples in my own career where product was actually leading the engineering organization. Spent many years at HomeAway. Some of you may know this, or another brand name in the US is VRBO. It's currently, or by now, it's actually part of Expedia, where Tom Hale was CPTO, and really in that order, CPTO, and had both product and the technical organization under him. And this worked really well, specifically in a consumer type platform with obviously high interaction. And the other thing that I felt was really standing out for me here on that slide and worrying me is the 52% sales. Where I'm really thinking, I mean, this is not the reporting, right? If I'm reading this correctly, it's about influencing.
Partnership,
it says in partnership. Yeah. And if a product person or the product executive considers only in half of the cases to have influence on sales, that's something that is very debatable. And I think it's not surprising, and I'm seeing this conflict every day. I'm also seeing it in my most recent role here, which is more a bit of a B2B background, where the transition is happening from a more sales-led to at least mutually sales and product-led type of growth scenario. But tying sales and product together or not tying it together is a problem. Tying it together is really, really key to success. So those would be a couple of comments I have. And I'm really, really interested to kind of get into a discussion with all of you on the call, how you see it. If you are one of those people who have said, I'm not really influencing sales, I'd like to hear from you. How is this? I mean, what does that mean for your day-to-day work? And I'm also, like to hear of your different reporting experiences and what do you think works best for you?
And the thing I'd add to what Tobias shared, and again, we're teeing up some good discussion for Q&A, hopefully, is I'm definitely seeing some bifurcation in the role in the US. So I think particularly in this current more recessionary climate, I think a lot of companies are getting really creative about how many C-level leaders they really need and how to hire well and selectively. And so what's hard is there isn't one clear theme, but the if there is a theme, it's actually a splitting of the roles for product to be a little bit more technical, as Tobias is saying. So sort of that CPTO formulation, and often actually the P is bigger than the T, and unless the technology is really the differentiator and something extremely sophisticated and highly technical, the P trumps the T, I would say. Or actually becoming a little bit more commercial. So, and actually this is perfect timing for this next slide, but I'm seeing a lot of focus on also a permutation of product and CMO together to be a chief customer officer or chief experience officer, some title aside, but sort of a merging of those roles. But it was interesting from the survey that one of the top thrive factors, so what have CPOs benefited from across the course of their careers and through their trajectory, the top one was customer centricity, followed very closely by growth mindset. Most of the others are not surprising in terms of product knowledge. I'm surprised customer comes before product, but interesting. But as we tee up this conversation around the future trajectory, it was interesting that financial literacy came towards the bottom. And you'll see that come through again in terms of the relationships. And I would say anecdotally, anytime I've had a search or a conversation where we're looking at product leaders for CEO roles, I'd say one of the key holdbacks is sort of their depth of expertise in terms of financial and P&L management, not having an accounting degree certainly, but how savvy are they with a P&L? Have they held a P&L? Can they partner effectively with a CFO? So it was interesting to see like a lot of self-reflection here. So a lot of interesting stats on the slide. I would say the key one to me, and we all discussed this as a team, is the top right, which is interesting that only 10% don't intend to move up to a CEO position eventually. That frankly surprised all of us. That's a lot. That's higher than I thought. I think and you'll see in a moment around retention factors, but I think what's interesting is seeing a lot more opportunity over the last 5 years. This role has really risen in importance. I'd say when I went to college, I guess very much dating myself, there wasn't a degree in product. There is a degree in product, that speaks to the importance of this role. But I think it also is important to think about the fact of like, how do we motivate folks? If, 90% might want to be a CEO, only 58% think that it's likely in the next 5 to 15 years. So like, how do we actually think about retention, motivation? And then for those for whom this is an important part of their career step, how do you sort of fill the skill competency gap, right, in terms of positioning them on? Any reflections on this, Tobias, kind of as you think about kind of whatever you're open to sharing in terms of CEO skills in general, trajectory? Be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing here is obviously that there is, it speaks for itself that that the product function has matured. And obviously the slides boast a certain self-confidence, so to say, in the sense, I'm now at the level of a CPO, and yes, of course, I do want to grow into a CEO role for a relatively young function, or I'd say this is great. It should all give you a lot of confidence that you're on the right track. If you go back one slide, Raphael, the one thing that I find interesting in this context here is also that industry and domain knowledge isn't really required to the same level than obviously the tool set that you have as a product expert, right? And I think that should be another thing that gives you confidence in your own personal career planning, right? Once you do master the product function with the skills and the tool set that you have acquired or that you apply, it's not really important to you, obviously, and I can echo this from my own experience, whether you apply this in a B2C environment or even in a B2B environment, because it's a lot about exactly this customer centricity and data-driven approaches. So those would be my immediate reactions to the two slides, and I think it's a fantastic development, and great to see that.
Good. We can keep going. So we already teed some of this up, but in terms of the competencies, in terms of kind of moving to that CEO skill set, So first of all, the majority would benefit from additional professional development. We see that, and it was interesting to see board management come out as a key item, financial knowledge as well. I think the strategic thinking, the people leadership, I would reflect as I think about candidates is there, and I think a lot of great self-reflection here in terms of how folks rated themselves. But it seems like the key really is in terms of that CPO to CEO journey and kind of crossing the chasm, if you will, is going to be around financial leadership and depth, as well as sort of interface with the board and, frankly, even more so external interface.
But if I may chime in, I mean,
of course,
this is again, I want to give you confidence here, right? I mean, if you ask your current chief commercial officer or your chief marketing officer who may have similar ambitions becoming CEO, I would expect to see a similar rank, right? In the sense of the CFO, of course, is the one who has the deepest and should have hopefully the deepest financial knowledge, right? Then managing analysts and board management is something you learn this by doing this, right? And I only started learning all this and getting confidence in this in my very first CEO role. And so I would not, I mean, see this as in any way a blocker. This just comes with experience. It comes with doing it. Strategic thinking, people leadership, these are obviously the skills you need to have in any leadership role, and the rest develops. So this is all good news.
Good. And I know we're going to try and keep ourselves in time, so maybe 5-6 more minutes, and we'll turn it over to Q&A because I think that's always the most helpful and most interesting part. But even though we shared the stat before, only 10% don't want to be CEO, and so 90% do. This is not the most critical retention factor. So of course, remuneration, growth. I would say growth of your product is really to me about impact. Culture, I think all of this is around broader potential opportunities. So I think it was interesting is, there's a lot of other ways to motivate folks. There's, each company has one CEO and that takes time, and there's lots of potential successors. There's a lot of other ways to sort of seek fulfillment and satisfaction in terms of future career path. Maybe we just move to the last one here, and then I'd love to open it up for discussion because I am so keen to hear where the conversation goes. But we reflected recently, this came from an article we wrote around why we think product leaders can make great CEOs. Again, I think I'm seeing this much more in tech and software, to be clear. I think in the future, we might see this in other fields and industries. But to me, it's centered in 4 things, and certainly not going to read the slide to you, but these could be good themes for discussion. But number 1, exceptional prioritization. So as product leaders, we're always thinking about feature rationalization, kind of being thoughtful about voice of the customer, a roadmap. Like that's the prioritization that it takes to be a great CEO. Skillful collaboration. So product roles I've observed generally tend to be slightly smaller teams, but super matrixed, super collaborative with other functions, be it technology, marketing, operations, sales. I think they have to work across the organization to get things done. Third is around customer centricity. So it's interesting. I think historically, sometimes we thought about marketing as voice of the customer, but it's not. It's sort of how do you get the customer? Voice of the customer and representing customer need really comes down to product leaders. And as I interview really great product leaders, the thing that comes back time and time again is how close they are to the customer and how thoughtful they are. That's really what it takes to be a great CEO, is being thoughtful about your customer and kind of what they need, and knowing how to deliver not what they say they need, but how to get ahead of those needs, and frankly, even being thoughtful about who your customer is. And finally, future orientation. This is quite obvious, but sort of that growth mindset and future potential is really what product leaders are thinking about all the time. And I observe that's what makes great CEOs, is you're always thinking not where you are today, about what's in store for the future and how to get there. With that, we're super keen to get to Q&A and hear the questions. I think Mark and Raphael, you guys are moderating. I will let you guys do your thing. I think questions can be for anyone on anything. So please.
And just inviting you to add them to the chat so maybe we can sort a bit. So far, a bit hesitation, but that's quite normal. So maybe just breaking the first one to the room, if I may, would be curious. I mean, we were surprised about some of the answers. both in how high they are or low they are. And maybe coming back to one of the first ones, maybe who of the product leads in the room reports to the CEO, and or, I mean, maybe we can start with that with a hand raising, just to see whether the survey is a good representation in the room. Cool. I mean, just to get a reaction from the room, we were surprised about the 90% want to become CEO eventually. We didn't expect this yet. Any reactions there? I mean, is that what I mean, could be your own ambition? Is that what you observe in the in your network? Any thoughts around that would be super interesting for us as we on the Egon Zehnder and Peak product side try to work kind of with the whole community to understand the ambition, to understand how we can best support from all angles, and maybe also to hear from you what you feel is missing on your journey there.
I can start if you guys want. So on mine, I've been a CPO in the US for the last 10 years. Various size companies, the last one fairly big, like a 300 people plus company, like we're getting close to $1 billion valuation. And I think for me, I've always wanted to put my career in the path towards becoming a CEO. And I think one of the challenge I faced as I was building the skills and increasing my tool set was how to navigate the overlap in responsibilities to some point between a CPO and an actual CEO of the company. What I've seen is as I've progressed and asked for more, my role has become so close to the CEO that it often led to some level of confusion. So who do we follow? Because Gilles is the one driving most of the strategy, telling us where we need to go, the big bets. But then the CEO comes and sometimes agrees, but sometimes disagrees, and there's conflict there, which is tricky. So, and for me personally, it has led me most of the time to actually evolve my role from CPO, like at the current company, I went from CPO to president because of that. But I'd be curious to understand that overlap, how to navigate it, and then that's my primary question.
And if I may, just thinking, maybe to put you on the spot, Tobias, but push back, please. I mean, how are you living it with your CPO? Where do you find you're complementing each other, and where do you find is potential conflict or not?
Yeah, I can very much relate to what you say, Gilles. I mean, this is obviously, especially in companies that are very product centric and that require a good product function to deliver growth. There is a fairly high overlap between general strategic decisions and then basically the product domain in itself, right? This is not necessarily the case in organizations that have at least a stronger sales element, right? So, for example, right now, Mark, to your question, the company I'm running right now here, which is a fintech platform, has a very successful land and expand business model. That means there is an element that always comes first, which is an enterprise sales element where the platform is sold. That's been done through sales, and then the platform usage, which is a very key element also of monetization, then is run by product. So in that case, I think it is super important, and that's what I'm seeing with my CPO, who's a fantastic CPO. She and then also other product people, we need to constantly make sure that we take all aspects of the life cycle into account. And with this, I mean you need to put yourself into the shoes of a salesperson or customer success person. And that's also an advice I would have for the ambitious product leaders, is really to train this 360 view on the organization and on the stakeholders. There is clearly a tendency to say, and in many cases, I totally get it, where you say, okay, product needs to deliver the growth. So I'm literally seeing myself in leading the strategy and potentially running that. But it's super important to be inclusive also in this stakeholder management, right? And then maybe a second aspect of that, which I'm also find important, and I'm pushing this in my organization, is that product starts to continuously document the successes and really educates organizations about what they do and what makes product successful. And I think I've worked both in the US and in Europe, and most time in Europe. This is much more important in Europe, where this product function, as you also said, Raphael, is still a bit more, in its infancy. That this documentation education piece is something that you do not forget while everything else piles up around you. So those would be two immediate reactions. But yeah, hopefully that helps.
And I think that's an interesting point from my observation, where I like the product community a lot. I see a lot of humbleness, right? I think a lot of people, a lot of the groups, and what might sound sympathetic, they don't beat their own drums too loudly often. So there might be an element, Tobias, here I'm just putting this out there, of pushing these communications aspect of speaking about your successes and your work. I really like this thought, I have to say. Maybe with regard to Andreas' point, Raphael, do you want to maybe?
Yeah, and yeah, thanks. Andreas is asking essentially path to CEO, being inspired by something. So I can take that question because I'm working personally as an angel investor. I'm invested in quite a lot of companies, but also with Peak Product. We're working both with scale-ups and corporate as well. I mean, just a couple of thoughts. The one is try to get close to a CEO, right? Like if you work in a bigger environment, I mean, like if you find the Tobias equivalent, like somebody who's very open to, exchange learning, that's obvious one. Another one, scale-ups. I mean, I'm talking to a lot of scale-ups that where, for example, founders now realize, I would like to professionalize product because product is really key for growth, like Tobias said. And they're very open to hiring, potentially maybe founders stepping out or make product people CEO, because especially at scale-ups, it's often really very similar. And then if it's really about starting something on your own, I mean, there's always a little bit of magic and unplannability in innovation. But even there, right, like falling in love with a customer problem, meeting with startups and folks that have ideas, right? I think there's a lot about just doing things, exposing yourself to problems, to ideas, to founders, and the innovation space, and then things just naturally happen. And have the courage. I mean, to Mark's point, people are maybe a little bit too timid, and you can be bold and change things,
So I'd add, this is going to be a hot topic. So I was a startup founder before joining Egon Zehnder. So I'll just say two things. One is I think it's just having curiosity and having a lot of conversations. And my big thing is just have the chat. Whatever is the conversation, be really open to it. Try to suspend judgment. And I think sometimes the idea does come for you too, but you have to have the right idea, I think, and really be really excited about it to make the leap. But the second thing is, to be a CEO, you don't have to be a founder, right? There's so many other pathways. And I think within organizations, it's sort of obvious, but sometimes you have to go smaller to go up. And if you're willing to go smaller, you have the bigger chance to go up. And I would also say there's go smaller to go up and go lateral to go up. And what I mean by that is you can also start to scoop up additional responsibilities. So Andrea, not knowing totally your background or kind of what you've taken on, but for product leaders that I talk to, even in bigger mid-sized companies that are trying to get to that CEO role, but thinking about how to position themselves, my question is always like, well, can you take on operations? Can you take on marketing? Can you, kind of work with your CEO to see what additional functions you can sort of have either exposure to, partner with, or scoop up if there are leadership transitions? Because I think all of those kind of give you that breadth in terms of being the CEO. But I would think go down to go up, go lateral to go up, or you need that brilliant idea.
And maybe just a thought on stepping stones as well, because I think what we see in the difference in Europe versus the US is that many businesses in Europe were founded by business people who do not have the product expertise. So I think you don't necessarily need the brilliant idea. They actually good ideas and companies out there who actually at a fairly late stage, even in the €1 billion turnover size, only establish a senior product role. And that's interesting to come in, and then interesting also as a potential stepping stone to further CRO. So I think there the difference between Europe and the US is actually an opportunity with this regard. Maybe going to Laura's question on tough economic times and how roles are joined. Maybe Raphael, Tobias, are you?
Here's the thing. I'd like Anna to maybe comment on whether the CTO is being picked or not. I think this is probably more like a question for her. But Laura, if you can, because I'm personally really interested in, can you tell me why you think engineering and product should literally be run by two different C-level members?
I believe that there's a natural and healthy tension between product and engineering. And if you look historically, and I've been in product for too many years to even confess, but when I started in product either reported under marketing or under engineering. And neither of the two were good, because if you were under marketing, product was really sales driven and what was the next thing. But if it was under engineering, it really was the technology driving the product. You didn't have that consumer centricity. And I feel we've come a long ways. First, we became a separate department. Now that department actually has a C-level person, which is something that started happening only recently, like a couple of years ago, which I think was a great progress, because really it is, product is that nexus, as Anna was showing. Really, product is the nexus between things. Engineering is purely on the technology side. But what I've seen happen is that when companies need to start reducing cost, as periods that we're going through, and the leadership team decides that they need to reduce cost at the leadership team, the natural tendency is to say, well, fold product under engineering, because engineering is a bigger team. So in terms of size, the engineering lead, the CTO, typically is running a much larger organization. And so it feels like the natural direction. And I think it's the wrong direction. However, and I think that as CPOs, we may need to be more aggressive in saying, no, we can run product and engineering. As long as you have a strong technical VP, product would be in a better position. But I've seen it, and it's happened to me, that the assumption is, well, engineering is bigger. The leader in engineering should just get the product managers under them.
Yeah. Okay, that helps, because I really, I wanted to make the point that literally, if this is happening, product should be confident enough to step up and say, I am the P here. The P comes first and then the T comes second, right? But I mean, I think it is probably very much dependent on the maturity of the company and the product function, right? I agree with you. If maybe the product function isn't mature enough or isn't ingrained in the company's DNA to a level that it may still fall back under the CTO, that would be wrong. I agree with you, right? But the good news is, and I think that's what you're elaborating to, the product function has grown in its importance and its understanding so much that it actually can now lead a joint organization. So my point was, if there is a combination of the two, I would trust product to actually lead this. Anna, maybe you can chime in as well.
Yeah, so interesting. By the way, Laura, I don't disagree with any of that. I think the healthy tension is really important. And I think I would argue engineering doesn't really channel voice of the customer as an example, right? Like that's not to bring back sort of Office Space. I always make that joke where just like the guy was like, I talk to the engineers because like the salespeople can't, but that's product kind of. So I agree with you. I think the healthy tension is important. And also I agree with Tobias that when I see it done well, product is the bigger one, right? It's like the bigger P and the T report to the P. I think what is hard is I think sometimes some leaders have found that healthy tension turns unhealthy, and now you have a lot of chiefs, and that that tension takes a lot of negotiation and management. And I think there does need to be a bit of a hierarchy. I think in terms of like, where is the ultimate decision coming from? Probably the CEO, but I think the PT does need a weighting. Where I've seen it work well is when there's a thoughtful conversation around what is really our differentiator, which sounds sort of basic, but if technology is the differentiator, so there's just like a super sophisticated algorithm or AI that frankly a product leader may not be able to manage, right? Because it requires so much technical depth, and that is the differentiation in the market. It probably makes sense for them to be equal peers, right? And maybe even the T to be bigger. When the differentiation is a little bit more about the go-to-market and sort of the customer framing, the P always wins, right? I would say. And so, but I think being thoughtful around where really is the differentiation. So we have a search right now as an example with health tech, and they have a very strong CRO, Chief Revenue Officer, very strong CTO, and they're trying to figure out where product goes. And the reality is you probably don't need a third very strong peer, right? And that's the conversation we're trying to have is the healthy debate might be between the CRO and the CTO actually in that regard. So I think what is good is the creativity. And I agree with you, Laura, completely on keeping some of the healthy tension in debate.
Can I make one more comment? And I know we have questions waiting. I think to me, what's much more important than the reporting question is the way of working, right? And those of you who obviously are experienced product people, they know what the magic that can happen when you have engineering start joining the conversations with your customers, when you set up the product trios, when you really have all relevant stakeholders in the room or at the table, right? And this can happen perfectly with the CTO and CPO in place if they are all clear about the right strategic direction. And I think the reason why sometimes it is a better idea to have the P leading is because engineers naturally, not all of them, but naturally tend to actually say, I do not want to actually be part of this conversation with the customer, right? I rather like to sit in my room and code. And that's fair, but I have seen the same thing here. I mean, the resistance to a point where where great engineers said, no, I'm not doing this. And when we had them joining, real magic happened. And those are people now that literally are probably even the best customer success or salespeople I can think of. They come up with great ideas. So much more important than reporting is literally getting these ways of working right and bringing out the engineers to the customer and have them basically join these conversations.
Want to move to the COO to CEO question, but there was also a hand raising and just not sure about, you have to help me here. Is it Moises? I get the pronunciation wrong for sure.
It's fine. Moises is fine.
Okay, Moises. Have you seen, is that something you have seen in the market? Maybe before we answer, we see it occasionally, I would say, but is there a more concrete aspect around that maybe?
No, I think I have seen articles about that. I think because the COO, especially when the COO is not a chief operations officer, but it's more a chief operating officer, then the path to CEO seems more natural. Because also like that gives you opportunity to manage operations, go to market, revenue, more P&L ownership of certain areas. So it feels more well-rounded profile, more experience to get to the CEO role. So I think like Anna mentioned, this lateral move, something I had in my mind is moving to what I would consider a lateral move, a COO role at the same level that a CPO role. But these are a path to get into a CEO because you get some of these skills or at least signals that third party would want in terms of financial expertise or like P&L ownership.
Yep. And then Anna, you wanna go first on this one? You're muted.
Still 3.5 years after the pandemic, still muted. But yes, others please chime in. I have some thoughts, but we're all deal with the data points that we see. So I just prefer others also broader thoughts. I think CEO can really help. I really do, because I think it's a completely different and complementary skill set. And I think together they're a pretty winning combination because the CEO gets you a little bit closer to the operations, but also the financial management. And depending on what's part of the COO role, it could really help to broaden a product leader. And I think one of the critiques of product leaders sort of being qualified for CEOs are so growth oriented that they're not bottom line oriented. CEOs inherently often have to be very bottom line oriented. So I think it could be very helpful. My only thought there is choose COO roles carefully. We think about when we take on COO searchers ourselves, these people are often, they're not just successors, they're also like in front of the firing squad of the rest of the team, because there's always sort of a, kind of a decision of who's going to be the successor, who's, what is the real scope. These can be exceptionally tough roles that don't always have clear boundaries. So my thought on COO, they're just very hard jobs. So I would just choose really, really wisely if that's the direction that you're going, and be thoughtful around the scope, the role, how it interfaces with the rest of the team, and sort of understanding the future growth potential. But that might be the data points I've seen. I'm curious, Mark, kind of, and others, like, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. And do you want to actually, we'll take up the offer of the experience moving into the COO/president role, maybe to hear you directly on this.
Yeah, so I will completely agree with Anna about being very cautious about the CEO or president role, depending on the organization and its size, because depending on how the organization is structured and your role and responsibilities and how it's clear from the CEO, it can be a very tricky situation as to how you present to the board and how you present to the rest of the organization. Like, I've been in an organization in my first CEO role where there was the Queen of England structure, where there is the CEO, me as a CEO, and everyone reporting into me. And this created a very much complexity in terms of the organization, not understanding like what is actually the role of the CEO outside of being a public-facing persona, but not really clear in terms of responsibility and accountability of different things. In terms of the value from on my end, and as Anna said, it's the first role that's you're gonna behead if there's any issues going on between the two roles, between the CEO and the CEO. So if there's not a strong dynamic and clarity of responsibility and split between the CEO and CEO and president, you're going to be the first one to be cut. The benefit personally from CPO to those roles is exposure to board. Most of the time, you tend, and the two experiences I've had, I became responsible for board management. So preparing the board materials, being a lot more strategic and understanding the entire spectrum of the organization rather than the CPO purview. And being able to transform some of the influence that you used to have as a CPO in influencing others, and now putting that into more concrete action, which is like defining the objective of the organization, defining some of the more strategic things beyond just the product or tech org, going on sales, customer success, marketing, etc., which is also a very valuable skill, because now you're forced to doing what you've done, the prioritization, etc., resource allocation, risk taking from your own like department set beyond.
Just a thought maybe, and I also, one thought is actually look at the operating model, right? Because in the US we see more of the very outbound facing CEO. So to the point that Anna also made. The other thing I'm just thinking out loud, listening to the advantages you just described, is what we see only a bit in the market in terms of development, but we believe that actually we should see more of that in terms of prepping product leaders for ER roles, is taking on non-executive roles, right? Roles where you see the other side of the table and where you're forced to take on a holistic view. So actually in terms of taking a step which brings you further, and we haven't mentioned yet, that's why I'm just mentioning it, and we had it in different discussion rounds, I think that could be another aspect of rounding off your experience and views. And being mindful of time, if we have one more question, we could probably take it. So if there's any more sentiment in the room, but we also don't want to overrun. Everyone agrees. I think a big thank you particularly for Tobias joining us here, Anna, Raphael, and the group, and the lively discussion, and looking forward to more of this kind soon. I don't know, Raphael, any last words on your end?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Have a great day.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all. Thanks for sharing
Thanks
your day
all.
with us.
Bye.
Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.